Hi everyone, welcome back to the Cobalt 27 Electric Metals blog. With us, we have one of our board members, Nick French. Nick, thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're listening.
Now Nick, you've got a background in the cobalt sector that stretches back nearly 40 years. For anyone who's new to the Cobalt 27 story, can you give us a quick overview of that career?
Yes, 40 years I'm afraid it is. I started in the late 70s when there was an invasion of Congo, or what was then Zaire, by communist-backed rebels from Angola. And in my first year at the trading desk, I saw the price go up from $5 to $50 a pound. And that's when I realized that I had a love affair with cobalt and its adrenaline, and it hasn't let me down over the years. Since that time, I've been involved in running if you want, a boutique specialist cobalt trading business called SFP Metals. I retired from that a couple of years ago, thinking that I would have the quiet life, but as soon as I retired, cobalt became very exciting again. And so I'm delighted to be part of the Cobalt 27 team and trying to navigate our way forward into this new and exciting time.
Well, I think I speak for all shareholders when I say we're delighted that you're on the board. Now, for most people following the space, it's clear that cobalt is firmly in the minds of automakers and indeed any manufacturer that needs lithium-ion batteries, which of course use cobalt as a component. However, based on your experience, is there anything you've seen in recent weeks that investors should be taking particular note of?
Well, I think the last couple of weeks have really highlighted something which maybe was always the case, but a couple of events have really starkly brought that to the forefront. I think anyone listening to this blog is probably already familiar with the general EV theme, with the critical supply and demand situation for cobalt, with the fact that it depends at the moment, 65% of the world's supply comes from Congo. But I think probably the more interesting dimension that's been brought to light in the last couple of weeks has been really the fact that it now is quite a large piece on the chessboard of geopolitics, and that it has now become almost an instrument of economic control and power. Let me be more precise on that. The Economist magazine, which I think we all globally respect for its analytical and, if you want, non-sensational style, put the issue in a nutshell with its headline at an article last week. It said, "What if China corners the cobalt market?" Just to give you a bit of historical context, in the late 70s, when I began in the business, as I mentioned, there was an invasion of what was then Zaire, now Congo. That led the prices to rise from $5 to $50 a pound in a matter of 6 months. At that time, the Western world saw the Eastern Bloc possibly as controlling all the critical materials from Africa, and they established stockpiles, particularly of cobalt: Japan, Korea, France, UK, Sweden, and of course the largest of all, USA. All those stockpiles have since been sold off. But if we fast forward to the current situation, obviously the situation with China is not a military one at all. In fact, it's simply a question of economic support. And one, in a way, could congratulate China for its vision and its foresight in a way that they've acted to protect their industrial interests and protect their environment. I think if I throw just a couple of statistics at you to epitomize that, really to show that the rest of the world is simply scrabbling to catch up, that the Chinese are the last nation who still have, and are building up, in fact, a national government stockpile. They have over 5,000 tons at the moment. More importantly, over 80% of the world's current refining capacity for raw materials into battery products is in China. If you add to that the battery material that comes from a plant in Finland called in Kokkola, this figure approaches 90%. Why do I add that? I add that because that plant is supplied by a Chinese cobalt producer in Congo called China Molybdenum. But the most striking event of the last couple of weeks, really, that has brought to light how much we are possibly falling into the Chinese hands, is that Glencore, and we all know that Glencore are the world's largest producer of cobalt. Last year they produced about 39,000 tons, which represented about 35% of the world's production. Glencore announced, more likely the buyer, GEM in China, announced that they had bought over 50,000 tons of cobalt from Glencore, deliverable over the next 3 years. That will represent over 1/3 of Glencore's production for the period. I think when people saw that, the automakers in Europe suddenly got very nervous and realized that if they didn't catch up, they would be looking into an empty barrel of cobalt. I think the moment that became clear was when Ivan Glasenberg, speaking at the Financial Times Commodity Conference in Lausanne last week, made it clear that his responsibility was to his shareholders and not necessarily to be involved, as he put it, in world politics. And that he was certainly open to selling more cobalt to China, or even actually the cobalt-producing assets themselves. if I give you a couple of quotes from Glasenberg, the motor car industry hasn't woken up to the fact how important cobalt is and how tight cobalt is. And he then went on to say the Chinese will have most of the offtake of cobalt. They're not going to sell batteries to the world. More than likely, they'll produce batteries in China and sell electric vehicles to the world. I think people like VW, BMW, Daimler, and of course the big US companies are going to be thinking twice now about where they stand in the global pecking order. And that's why I think, given the fact that the car has been so long a representative of US economic dominance and US way of life, that's going to shape them to the core. It did occur to me that in the same way as we had the stockpiles of metals, including cobalt, some years ago, that the USA might decide to re-establish, given the hawkish cabinet that Trump is running himself in, that they might try to establish a stockpile of cobalt again somewhere in the near future. When John Bolton was introduced as the new National Security Advisor last week, one of his famous quotes is, "If you want peace, be ready for war." Again, one wonders whether cobalt, which of course is an ingredient of jet engines as well as batteries, and more specifically military aircraft jet engines, might be something that they feel somewhat vulnerable to. So I think in summary for that particular point, and I'm sorry I've gone on so long, I think the fact that cobalt is now seen as a global economic weapon almost has been something that is new to the cobalt market.
So with all of that in mind, how do you think investors specifically can look to potentially benefit from the situation?
Well, it's a tricky one because, of course, in setting up Cobalt 27, we looked at various automobile companies. Do we buy shares in Ford or in Tesla even, or, of course, in the European ones? And the question there is it's difficult to know who's going to win. You could be a buyer in a buyer of shares in a cobalt mine. There's obviously e-cobalt in the States. There's First Cobalt in Canada. There's Clean Tech in Australia, all of which are projects which we have no reason to think won't succeed in producing the cobalt. But the difficulty is getting the leverage that you might want from the EV theme itself. Now, I realize that not only do I work for Cobalt 27, but I'm very interested in its success. But I would point out to you that the theme behind Cobalt 27 is not only to be involved in the cobalt, the raw material itself, but to look at expanding into royalties, into streaming, and eventually downstream into the battery makers themselves. And that gives you access to a cross-section of the chain from raw material all the way through to EVs. So that obviously is why I think we're a very, very interesting product.
Well, as I've said to our CEO, Anthony Maluski, many times, it's certainly an exciting time to be an investor in Cobalt and specifically a shareholder in Cobalt 27. Nick, thank you very much for your time today and look forward to speaking to you again soon.